Hello, everyone. My name is Donald Rufus-Raphael, and the following is my presentation on addressing racial disparities in the juvenile justice system. Thank you for listening. So the topic of this presentation is, of course, like I mentioned, addressing the racial disparities in the juvenile justice system, examining the policies that have worked, the policies that don't work, and policy recommendations that could work. Now, the main goal is to find the causation of these racial disparities and how to solve them. I decided to go with this because a study conducted by Jagomir and Tadros in 2020 states that juveniles of color account for the majority of those charged and incarcerated in the juvenile justice system. Race plays an unnecessary role in a juvenile's fate in the system, in addition to how they are treated. The disparities between races have a detrimental effect on juveniles in different ways, ranging from mental to physical, and their reputation as well. There's a lot of myths spread around. Policy goals are to reduce the disparities and provide equality among all juveniles, regardless of race, but the current policies in place fail to do so, resulting in the current need for change. The first policy to be examined is most likely the most significant one. It is the disproportionate minority contact, also known as the DMC. It was developed by Congress in the late 80s and early 90s, and it was developed to reduce the minority overrepresentation in the juvenile justice system. That mainly targets all minority juveniles that are overrepresented being detained, being arrested, jailed, or securely defined as they define in their bills. It was meant to overhaul the current system at the time because there was nothing in place to stop the racial disparities or the overrepresentation of minorities. Ultimately, it resulted in very minimal changes, which has led to the whole concept of the DMC be considered somewhat bad or detrimental, as it just allowed for 10, 20, 30 years of stagnant change, stagnant numbers. In some cases, it's even increased the disparities. Overall, it's been very hard to calculate the actual effect it's had positively on the overrepresentation, but on the other hand, it's been quite easy to see that it hasn't worked out the best. Continuing on with why the DMC had such low results and is often considered a failure, states were very unwilling to implement the policies that were recommended in the DMC or oftentimes required. States are also very slow to implement them as well, meaning the states that did implement them took a very long time to fully get the programs in, which all of that resulted in very low effectiveness. Ultimately, the racial biases remain significant, and in a lot of cases, the percentage of disproportion between African American minorities and white minorities and other races have increased. In the early 90s to mid 2000s, there's been amendments throughout those years to try and improve the DMC, force states into moving faster, try and remedy the low effectiveness that the program has had. However, it's ultimately resulted in the same issues of states not wanting to do it or the program just not being all that effective. With the efforts going lower, the detainment and the arrest rate between races has ultimately favored white juveniles even more. As for additional reasons on why the disparities in the juvenile justice system have remained so significant and increased for so long, is that the DMC has not done enough to address the policing factor of the disproportionate rates. It was found in my research that policing and their strategies has been linked to the disparities in the juvenile justice system. The officers who arrest minorities are almost entirely white. Police have higher tendencies to arrest and detain rather than intervene and try to divert. The policing strategies and trainings are very absent from reforms like the DMC and other policies that attempt to decrease the racial disparities in the system. Additionally, organizational constraints do not allow police to have knowledge of situations like this. Oftentimes, police are very unaware that things like diversion programs or mental health treatment exist, which would oftentimes help reduce the disparities. And as I previously mentioned, officers involved with minority juveniles in arrest, detainment, and prosecution are almost entirely white, offering a lack of representation in the system that is taking them down. To further emphasize how policing strategies and staffing are linked to racial disparities in the juvenile justice system, further research that I conducted found that there is a difference between the rates of repeated arrests between minority juveniles and white juveniles, showing that minority juveniles are often arrested more and they are repeatedly arrested more times. Overall, that shows a system that favors the white youth. And oftentimes, the system is like that because the white officers want to uphold the system to maintain the status quo of their social interests. In a wider sense, or in a more direct sense, they want to keep their own safe. Another aspect that is playing a factor is that white juveniles often reported frequent second chances, being let go, off the hook, very frequently, while other race juveniles, specifically African American youth, reported the contrary, that they were never given that opportunity in any interaction with the police. The front end of the juvenile justice system also isn't the only problem as well, since there is a very big difference in treatment once they enter the system. Race is oftentimes a predicator for treatment once they enter the system, such as how they're treated, the punishments they get, the consequences, and so forth. For example, juvenile detention facilities have a 5-to-1 ratio of black to white youth detained. In another sense of stating that if you enter a juvenile detention facility, on average, there are 5 times as black children as there are white children. Treatment are given to juveniles based on race as well, depending on the type and the feeling towards juveniles. Oftentimes in African American youth situations, their crimes are blamed directly on their decision makings, and there's this myth that they create more crimes than their white counterparts, being spread off of that. On the other hand, white juveniles in the juvenile detention facilities are often seen as much less blameworthy. As for the last bullet point, differential treatment in regards to punishment is a factor, as school-based punishment leads to inequalities in the juvenile justice system. Essentially what that means is that the school-to-prison pipeline is very unfair to minorities, as minorities are often mistreated with punishment in school settings, which leads to the same behaviors happening in the juvenile justice system as well. Moving on from the policies that failed to cause effects on lowering the racial disparities in the juvenile justice system, I'm going to discuss the policies that did have positive effects. First off, the diversion programs are much more effective at lowering reoffending rates than standard treatments. Diversion programs are when at-risk youth are identified beforehand and try to be set on a better path. The research I was reading found that over 70 programs and 32,000 kids, those in diversion programs, had a 10% rate less recidivism, meaning they were 10% less likely to reoffend. Police-led diversion programs had a 6% lower rate on average of reoffending as well. The availability of these programs favor white juveniles much more than other races. In fact, prosecutors are 42% more likely to offer a diversion program to a white juvenile over an African American juvenile, and they are 30% more likely to offer a diversion program to a white juvenile over a other race juvenile. Other race meaning Asian and other races that aren't African American. Another treatment that had a positive effect was focusing on improving the juvenile's mental health. It was shown to be effective at rehabilitating youth, even with cases concerning violent offenses. The research shows that with the creation of treatment, with the understanding that minority populations are at risk in the context of the disproportionate rates in the system, that can be used to lower recidivism rates, specifically among minority juveniles. Basically, if professionals were to create a mental health plan under the pretext and the context of understanding that these children are at risk and are being put down by the system, it can offset the system itself. The last policy that I'm going to cover that had a positive effect is a minimum age law. A minimum age law is basically the lowest age a child can be held criminally responsible for something. It was shown that states with minimum age laws have lower disparities between races in their juvenile justice systems. 28 states currently don't. However, since laws affect all races equally, it causes an equality among all races in the juvenile justice system, at least under the age of whatever age they make it is. Now for policy recommendations. The first policy recommendation is creating equal access community programs. An example of that is Juveniles Breaking the Cycle. It's a community-based program in Oregon, and it's rooted in providing various services to high-risk substance abusing minority juveniles. Its primary goals are to increase availability of programs to minority juveniles. Like I previously mentioned, minorities have a harder time getting access to these programs, and overall lowering delinquency rates. The program was shown to recidivate less and have lower arrest numbers when compared with the control group of juveniles that did not participate in the program. Services that they provide include mental health treatment, case management in and outside of the court setting, and diversion tactics. The program often lasts for 12 months or more for increased treatment. As for concerns about this, it's completely funded through the National Institute of Justice and oftentimes has similar tax costs to standard treatments per juvenile. The second policy recommendation for lowering the racial disparities is the introduction of curriculum education. What these curriculums would do nationwide is target minority juveniles and aim to educate them in specific ways to lower recidivism and things like that. A direct example is Project Build. It's a curriculum that educates juveniles on decision making and aims to lower recidivism. It was shown that Project Build significantly lowered the rates of recidivism, and participants took longer to recidivate in the program across all races. So even though the program was specifically for minority juveniles, it affected all races. Now, there's often concerns over effectiveness of education on a national scale, but this is offset by its proven success via Project Build. As for the concerns about its cost, you could easily reallocate funds from existing programs like the DMC that I previously mentioned, the disproportionate minority contact, that are failing currently to significantly reduce the racial disparities in the system. The third and last policy recommendation I'd like to discuss is I want to create a nationwide minimum age law. As I mentioned previously, a minimum age law is the lowest age a child can be held criminally responsible. I think this would be specifically good since children are more protected from the juvenile justice system in states with a minimum age set to 12, as the research showed. The disproportionate numbers in representation between black and white juveniles were also very lowered in states with a minimum age law. Overall, it creates an equality among all races among those under 12, since the laws affect all races equally. Now, that was the end of my presentation. I would like to thank you for listening, and I hope you take everything I said into account when making policies. Thank you.